I am a citizen of Serbia, Croatia, Switzerland, and an overseas citizen of India. However, I do not consider myself multicultural, nor would I want to deconstruct my cultural identity by saying that there is nothing there on the bottom of it, that it's just a play of words. So to start at the beginning, how did I become Serbian? Well, I wasn't born Serbian. I was born in the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. And I experienced life in Yugoslavia for a few years before the secession wars of the 90s. So I experienced the life in the republics, going to vacation to the seaside in Croatia and going skiing in Serbia in the mountains in the winter time. And I didn't think much about the different ethnic groups that lived there, such as Croatians, Serbians, Macedonians, Slovenians, Bosnians, Kosovars, and so on. But when the war started, I had to ask my mom, are we Serbian or Croatian? We did live in Belgrade, the capital of Serbia, but we spent a lot of time in Croatia because the whole of my mother's side is from Croatia. And she told me, after thinking for a microsecond, Serbian. So then I knew which side we were on. However, when the country broke up and there was no more Yugoslavia, my mother applied for us to have a Croatian passport, so I became Croatian as well. Now, it was really interesting traveling with these two passports, like taking a train between the countries in the war zone, because we had to be really careful which passport we showed at which customs, to not to mix them up and mistaken, because they could kick us out of the train if they thought we were from the enemy's side, right? Now, we weren't directly impacted by the war. We didn't experience the bombings or anything like that. However, it was very difficult for my parents to keep their jobs at this time. So when my father got an opportunity to work at Taiwan, the whole family moved there, and we lived there for 5 years. I went to an American school in Taiwan, hence my slightly American accent to this day. And after those 5 years in Taiwan, we moved to my stepfather in Switzerland. And after a few years, I too received Swiss citizenship. Now, being a foreigner in Switzerland is quite different than being a foreigner in Taiwan. Whereas in Taiwan, we belonged to a privileged class and we were just simply known as Uyghur and foreigners. In Switzerland, I felt like I had to categorize myself right away. When I was asked where I'm from, it didn't suffice to just say from former Yugoslavia. People wanted to know specifically from Serbia or Croatia, perhaps because they too experienced the secession wars in Yugoslavia, because they received a lot of refugees from there, and they experienced them fighting in classrooms and fighting out their ethnic battles in the schoolyard. So in Switzerland, this ethnic membership was a very palpable issue. Whereas for me in the Far East, it was a non-issue for me growing up. And then after a few years, 4 years ago, I married my husband, who comes from India. And I received this little piece of paper here. This means that I'm an overseas citizen of India. That means that I don't need a visa when I travel there, for instance. And I can theoretically own land and property there, which is a privilege we haven't yet taken advantage of, but maybe someday. I also spent 5 months in the United States during my studies in Boston, and I spent 5 months living in Bosnia on an internship. So all of my passports are an external manifestation of my multiple identities, of the plurality of cultures within me. However, I would still not say that I am multicultural. So what do I mean by multicultural? Multiculturalism implies that all the different cultures in me are like compartments that contain different things, different collections of customs, different languages, different ways of behaving, and that they're just there next to each other, in isolation from each other, and kind of in tolerance, but indifference basically to each other. It's a way of thinking of cultures like things, of deadening them. So thinking of Serbian culture as basically to be equated with the folklore dances that we dance. Or thinking of Swissness in terms of cheese and chocolate. It's kind of like a kitschy collection of souvenirs. that we conjure when we think of a certain culture. And I think that's the most common way that societies kind of handle the plurality of cultures within them, is this kind of multicultural approach by organizing events where each culture presents themselves by performing like their traditional dances or songs. However, everyone knows that a culture is more than that. It is something that's alive, that's changing. And sometimes we gain a better understanding of our own culture from the point of view of another culture. So cultures need other cultures in order to recognize themselves in their own specificity. Another way of approaching culture is deconstruction. It is to say that culture is not this fixed set things as the multicultural view would have it, but rather that it's always evolving, always dynamic, always reconstructing, and always open. In deconstruction, the self is always and constantly redefining itself, and it is not defined, determined, or fixed by origin. For instance, as Jacques Derrida, one of the founding fathers of deconstruction, has put it, sometimes the struggles under the banner of cultural identity, national identity, linguistic identity are noble fights. But at the same time, the people who fight for their identity must pay attention to the fact that identity is not the self-identity of a thing, this glass, for instance, this microphone, but it implies difference within identity. Once you take account of this inner and outer difference, then you pay attention to the other, and you understand that fighting for your own identity is not exclusive of another identity, is open to another identity. So I completely agree with this impulse from deconstruction to say that my identity shouldn't exclude somebody else's identity. And my identity is constantly evolving and dynamic. It's not the same as this microphone that's always self-identified with itself. For a culture to be a culture, it needs to be alive and moving and not just there as a thing. However, the problem I have with deconstruction is that by denying one's origin, one denies the specificity of one's culture. As Bell Hooks has formulated it in relation to the African American experience, the unwillingness to critique essentialism on the part of many African Americans is rooted in the fear that it will cause folks to lose sight of the specific history and experience of African Americans and the unique sensibilities and culture that arose from these experiences. So I too feel like, as attractive as deconstruction is in providing this very creative, playful way of framing identity as something that's dynamic and changing, I do too feel that something gets lost if we simply negate origin, namely the specificity of my experience that is different from that of the mainstream Western European Northern American experience. Just as the African American experience is different from white American experience. So I'm not in favor of objectifying origin and founding my identity on my Serbian origins. Rather, I agree with Michael Epstein's notion of transculture that he proposes as an alternative to both multiculturalism and deconstruction. And it is a way of combining the specificity of one's origins with the cultural creativity we have inherited from deconstruction. So what is it to be transcultural? The term transculturation was first introduced by the Cuban sociologist Fernando Ortiz in the 40s. He uses it to frame the Afro-Cuban experience that he was concerned with, and he uses it by contrast to the Western notion of unicultures, kind of self-sustaining monolithic cultures. The term was taken up in the 1970s in post-colonial discourses, also to talk about the contact zones between different culture. And nowadays the term is used to describe this kind of new transnational subjectivity that is emerging. So this idea of uniform culture, such as the German culture, the French culture, is relativized in the first place. And Michael Epstein, who is actually a Russian scholar, talks about this paternalistic aspect of multiculturalism in the former Soviet Union, where people were allowed to live their culture, but in a way that offered them no escape from this culture. They were to be the Georgians and to perform their traditional dances, for instance. And this view denies this kind of need for people to transcend their own culture, to go beyond what was given to them in their tradition. This is what keeps cultures alive. And he quotes T.S. Eliot's point in saying that culture is a way of escaping nature. It is a way of escaping exactly being fixed by one's origin or one's genes. But Epstein avoids this pitfall of completely negating one's origins and dehistoricizing oneself. He says, therefore, we need to rehistoricize the project of deconstruction, inscribing it within the future perspective of cultures, rather than denying their natural origins in the past. Cultures do have origins and are indeed sustained and determined by these origins. Only by accepting these origins can we posit a goal of disorigination, the flight from origins, as an emerging historical possibility. Instead of a theoretical denial of origins, we envision their historical overcoming. For this purpose, books, films, and all sign systems are created to dissolve the solidity of one's nature, one's identity, and to share the experience of the other. So I've told you the story how I acquired my 4 travel documents. However, that's not how I became transcultural. How I've become transcultural and how I'm striving to become transcultural all the time is by reminding myself that a culture is not a thing that you either have or not, and that I'm not made up all these different little compartments of different cultures. Rather, culture is a vital activity, a curiosity and an openness in the ability to take on the perspective of the other. And this does not mean negating one's own origins and the specificity of one's own history. On the contrary, these two activities go together and support each other.